Good evening, everyone. I'll begin with a housekeeping note. We are in a Zoom webinar as opposed to the Zoom meeting setting, and this event is being recorded. This doesn't permit you to speak, but I'd like to encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A section that's at the bottom of the screen. I'll convey your written questions to the speaker. First, I wish to express my thanks to all of you for joining us today, as well as to Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique and La Fabrique de France for supporting this event. My name is Jana Robinson, and I'm Managing Director of the Prague Security Studies Institute, PSSI. PSSI's mission is to help safeguard and strengthen the freedoms and democratic institutions of nations in Central and Eastern Europe and beyond. The Institute also seeks to illuminate emerging threats to the transatlantic alliance and other partners globally, especially in the economic and financial and outer space domains. In the past several years, the space environment has become more diverse with disruptive technologies and commercial actors. Moreover, the ability of nations to leverage space for defensive as well as offensive purposes, including in the gray zone environment, is fast improving, complicating deterrent strategies and response options in case of an attack or irresponsible behavior. The European Union introduced the concept of strategic autonomy, recognizing the role of NATO in defending its member states against external threats and calling for a better equipped, trained, and organized Europe that can contribute in meaningful terms to our collective security, as well as act decisively if and when necessary. In space, the focus has been placed on military space surveillance capacity, military PNT under the future Galileo PRS, satellite-enabled strategic C2 system, among others. Past US presidents Clinton, Bush, and Trump have raised concerns that the EU defense initiatives must not duplicate NATO structures and capabilities, decouple the United States from Europe, or discriminate against non-EU member states. The US National Defense Strategy of 2018 highlights the need to deepen interoperability with European allies and partners and fortify the transatlantic alliance. An important element of the transatlantic efforts will be to configure balanced defense industry participation. European countries constitute the world's largest single market under the umbrella of the European Union. As an economic power, the EU and its member states can play a decisive role in supporting a value-based global space order and fair space commerce that counters the predatory model of authoritarian space powers, particularly with respect to their structuring of international partnerships. This involves emphasizing free market principles, including disclosure, transparency, proper risk management, good corporate governance, protection of corporate reputations and shared values, preservation of sovereignty, and the rule of law. Will the declaration of space as the latest operational warfighting domain for NATO bring new opportunities to create closer collaboration between the EU and NATO? Is Europe prepared to use economic and financial policy tools such as sanctions or investment bans to counter irresponsible behavior in space? We will discuss these and other issues with our special guest, Mr. Xavier Pasco, whom now I have the pleasure of introducing. Mr. Pasco is director of the Foundation for Strategic Research. He's a respected expert in security, defense, space, and missile defense issues. He has overseen many projects related to European space security policies, transatlantic military space and interoperability, space technologies and critical infrastructure, space situational awareness, Earth observation ground segment system systems for security and defense, space traffic management, and other space and security related topics. He has advised the European Space Agency, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the French Ministry of Armed Forces, and the nonprofit Secure World Foundation, and has been a non-resident senior fellow at George Washington University Space Policy Institute. Mr. Pasco is a lecturer at the French Military School and the Institute of Political Studies, both located in Paris. He is also a full member of the International Academy of Astronautics and has published over 100 articles and a number of books related to his expertise. Xavier, thank you so much for agreeing to contribute to this event. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, for these kind words. And thank you, the Prague Security Studies Institute and La Fabrique Défense also for this, I think, a very timely discussion we can have on the contribution of Europe to space security. I will, in fact, use some slides, some PowerPoint presentation that I will try to share with you. And then, of course, I'll be very much open to discussing these different issues we can mention. So I'm trying to share this. Hopefully, this will be okay. I will now do this here. All right. And I will do this for you. I hope you can see the slides. Thank you for confirming that everything is fine on your side.
Everything is fine.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. So I'm very, very happy to be with you today to discuss these very hot topics, I would say, both regarding security in Europe and also regarding the space environment and its evolution, and has a lot of, in the last years, we have seen several very interesting and also very serious evolutions in the field of space security. The space environment has been changing very much over the last years, and I would like to give you some sort of perspective on how in Europe we can face this situation, and how Europe itself, in all its components, by the way, whether it's the EU, of course, NATO has been mentioned also, but also at the level of the member states themselves, we can get organized to better face the situation and address the multiple issues that have been raised recently. So first of all, I would like to open this discussion to provide you a historical perspective. I need to, okay, I need to have this. All right. Hopefully I will. Okay. So Europe and space as a whole history, the relationship between Europe and space is whole. Europe has been one of the first entity, political entity to bet on space technologies to ensure its own future and the future of its own industry and security. And still, Europe and space has a very singular history in terms of relationship. And I wanted to highlight this first because space was mostly the result of the Cold War, and was mostly the result of the investment by the two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, that choose to invest in space for ensuring the balance in their relationship, strategic balance, and for ensuring, I would say, the good functioning of the strategic balance during the Cold War. As far as Europe was concerned, the origins of its investment in space technologies and in space programs were very different. Mostly, Europe has invested in space first to make sure that the European member states at the time would share enough interests, common interests, and common positive outputs to invest in space by not really building, I would say, a security-oriented framework or capability, but rather build an open, constructive, and even international kind of approach that would in fact bet on the putting in common scientific and research and developments excellence that were embedded in member states in Europe. The point was really to make space a constructive investment that would provide a positive political identity to the nascent European Union at the time. And of course, this has had a very different result in the way Europe has built its own organization in the field of space. And it has enduring consequences today on the way Europe will approach aspects related to defense and security. So there was this idea of first and foremost highlighting domains of excellence in Europe by making space something quite similar that was made with, for example, with the creation of CERN for the nuclear domain, nuclear research, basic research domain. This was the tradition of highlighting the scientific skills and excellence of Europe to put Europe on the front stage of the international scene. Also, there was this idea in Europe historically from the start to use space as a way to demonstrate that Europe had a common identity and could, assume this identity by showing some sort of political maturity. The idea, again, was to show Europe as a positive construction that would, in fact, push and sustain a deliberate approach towards scientific excellence, but also cooperation and positive cooperation. So this idea of using space for demonstrating this kind of ability was really very powerful to explain why Europe paid attention to space policy and political investment very early on. And also space, and that's my third point here, was a provider of some sort of soft power in a context where it was felt difficult to get agree on a common European security and defense policy. There was the notion that by addressing the positive aspects of space investment, the positive aspects of space cooperation, and this would be a very strong cement, very strong link between, this would create a very strong link between the member states and would provide soft power, even if these different member states would not agree maybe on a more fundamental orientations related to strategy and defense. So space was a convenient domain that could be used to create some political identity without addressing some more touchy, some more difficult issues, namely at the time, issues related to defense and security. So this is, I would say, the rationale of this investment. And we can see this, the effect of this rationale nowadays, in fact, with basically two main entities paying attention to space in Europe. First, the European Space Agency, which is not part of the European Union and was created in 1935 as an intergovernmental body. And one of the key characteristic of this entity, it has been conceived as a research body and intended to rationalize national space R&D investment, national scientific investments. And there is this notion that in ESA, you have the importance of using space for peaceful purposes only. And this is something that has really, I would say, marked the identity of the European Space Agency until today. And so the European Space Agency has been created in the first place as a common scientific organization inside Europe. without having the political cloud, I would say, to address other kind of issues, such as security, such as defense, obviously. On the other hand, we have had the European Commission over the years, which had more and more which has been more and more interested in developing a European space policy, to the truth here. And the European Commission, of course, is mainly based on the EU member states' policies, and it has very differently from the European Space Agency oriented itself towards the development of what's called the flagship programs. The European Union has invested much more on applied programs, which means that these are programs that can be used for economic activities, for security activities in a sense, and it's been organized deliberately at the level of the European Commission because it had this kind of political weight that was needed to develop such programs. These programs, namely the two of the most well-known programs, are Galileo, and Diana mentioned Galileo, for example, as a PNT, precision navigation and timing programs that has been some sort of equivalent of the famous GPS, US GPS program. And we have also today, and very well-known and very successful Copernicus program, the former GMES program, Global Monitoring for Environment and Security. And this Copernicus program is using Earth observation satellites, whether it's in optical domain or in radar domain, to monitor the Earth, to provide some information in diverse domains. It can be in scientific domains, in environmental domains, but also it can have some applications for security-oriented domains. And these two programs, Galileo and Copernicus, are really the example of the kind of investment, and even I would say political investment, the European Commission and the European Union has been able to do in complement of the more scientific oriented programs that were developed at the European Space Agency level. So it's interesting to have these two, I would say, two legs to the European programs today, because it's really related to the early history of the construction of the European space program in the following years after the US and USSR programs that were developed during the Cold War. Okay, I hope, okay. So as I mentioned, the initial European approach was very different from the one adopted by other large spacefaring powers. As I said, in the US or in the USSR and today Russia, we had this importance of developing space programs to satisfy Cold War power strategies. Those programs were developed at the end of the 50s and during the 60s and 70s, and they were very much developed for addressing the issues raised by the necessity to find a strategic balance in the nuclear era. In this respect, we can say that space historically is also the result from the advent of the nuclear era. Space and nuclear are very much close to each other in terms of explaining why space was needed by these two superpowers so badly, I would say, and why they invested so much during this year to make sure that space systems were on the edge of technology and were able to constantly monitor what was going on the other side of the border. So it's been a very powerful driver historically for space as a whole, and especially in these two countries. We have other more recent comers, more newcomers that have also invested space in the last decades. and we know that these are now very key and leading space powers such as China, India, but also we have South Korea, Iran, and some other countries which have invested already at their respective levels in space applications. And we see in all of these countries very, very diverse origins. And usually what we see is a mix of domestic and international objectives. For countries like China or India, for example, it's particularly true in the case of India. There is this notion that space was first intended to help the economic development and of the subcontinent, and for those countries which have very large territories and very widespread populations over these territories, space has proven to be a very good technical tool to ensure national cohesion and national coherence also of public policies, you know, whether they deal with agriculture or whether they deal with infrastructure development, urban planning, etc., etc. But also these countries have very, very quickly realized that space was also a formidable way to demonstrate the level of excellence and the level of development in the technological field, in the highest technologies that would give themselves a political image to project, you know, and also give themselves and give the world an image of their power, and sometimes of their military power. And so you often end up with a mix of domestic and international rationales that explain the development of space in these countries. And you have also Europe, and I mentioned the particular history, the singular history of Europe, related to its ambitions and its the necessity to find space, to use space as a cohesive tool for building a common identity. We must not forget, of course, that at the level of member states, you also have programs which have key security and sometimes defense dimension. Whether it's at the level of the EU, and I mentioned Galileo, I mentioned GMES and Copernicus. We could mention today the European Union space and a space surveillance and tracking program that exists in this consortium of states that have been built in 2014 to create EU capability to monitor space, to know what's going on in space, to make sure that Europe has a good analysis of the space situation. And we also could mention, for example, some project like the GovSatcom program, which is intended to develop governmental space systems for SATCOM. And of course, on the national side of it, you have national military space programs that exist, more directly related to defense, and that France has been one of the leading countries in developing military space program, whether it's for Earth observation and for military observation, such as with the series of Helios 1 or 2 satellites, and also today the so-called CSO satellite, Composante Spatiale Optique satellite, which is a follow-up follow-up series after Helios 1 or 2. You have also the German satellites, radar satellites, such as Saarlupe or SARA today. And you used to have Skynet, of course. Excuse me. You had the British Skynet. We're not in Europe anymore. We're in Europe with the ESA. The Skynet was very much focused on the use by the British MOD, French Syracuse, and some others. So I think this is very important to recall that Europe has a combination of different programs, whether they are developed at the EU level, or they are developed at the ESA level, or they are developed at the national member states level. This is composing, again, here a very original arrangement. Okay. So if we focus on Europe, we can say that for years already, civil security missions, for example, and the monitoring of crisis has been the center of gravity for the development of European space program. I mentioned GMES, which is now called Copernicus. This is clearly this very important example of such a program. This program is managed by the European Satellite Center, the EU SATCEN, and the EU SATCEN is developing capability to analyze imagery and to provide in a very short times, in very short operational times, elements needed by the governments from the European Union to address crisis situation, humanitarian situation, or security situation. It can, for example, focus on the control of the borders of the EU, for example. It can also focus on maritime safety and security. And it can also focus on the monitoring of large wildfires, etc., etc. There is for years already a specific competence of the EU to and of the SATCEN to develop this ability to use this European Union program for the security, I would say, of the European citizen. There are a lot of different examples of these uses, and I just mentioned here and show that on this slide here some uses for vessel detection, for example. It's been used for protecting merchant ships, for example, from piracy during Operation Atalanta, and a number of European Union satellites have been used in support of these operations to make sure that the European merchant fleet was protected against attacks and could be more easily supported when needed. You have more and more very elaborated techniques that are also using space systems to also ensure maritime security and help European authorities to monitor illicit traffic, for example. You have here in the bottom of the slide, you have here an example of how you can use both radar images and also the capability to collect automatic identification systems that are compulsory for all the ships, all the merchant ships, and try to corroborate this data to make sure that you have a boat and physically existing at the place where it's emitting its own coordinates. And the point is really to make sure that everything is transparent, everything is licit, and you don't have any ship hiding and not communicating its own coordinates. So this is very much used at the European level, at the European Union level, and especially it's been used by the European Maritime Security Agency that's based in Lisbon. And this is obviously something that you cannot do without having this security-oriented applied satellites. But as you can conclude from my from this first part of my talk, we realize very quickly that Europe has never been very much, I would say, eager to develop more security-oriented programs for years. Again, it was sure that all the member states would agree on the use of those techniques to be ready to use it for security purpose. And of course, given also the sovereign nature of defense policies for each member state, it would have been difficult to develop more defense-oriented space programs. Still, of course, we have seen some marked evolutions in Europe on the issue. And in particular, I think one key step has been the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty, which both has created a reinforced foreign and security policy framework with modified and adapted organization inside the EU, and also in parallel has amplified the role of the European Union in the development of space policy. And space has been given a very important role in reinforcing the political status of the European Union in the field of foreign and security policy. So I think this is, I think, a key moment in the history of the European Union to boost, I would say, the relationship between foreign and security policy on the one hand and space policy on the other hand. This was also the result from a changing international environment. And for Europe, this rising notion of space security has been a lengthy process, in fact, that has started in the beginnings of the years 2000. In fact, the 9/11 events have really triggered in Europe, inside the European Union, the will to develop a new concept for enhancing the security of the so-called at the time, the security of the European citizen. This security of the European citizen has become then, at this time in 2003, 2004, declared as a key strategic goal. And in this context, space, the point was really to address security threat at large, and not only defense or military-oriented threats, really security threat. And the 9/11 events had been a wake-up call, has acted as a wake-up call at this stage. This was the time when the US was developing the so-called homeland defense capabilities. And there was the recognition at the EU level that the EU also had the need to develop some similar approach and capabilities. And in this reflection, and it's very well documented now, space has been recognized as an element of the security of the European citizen. And there has been a number of political documents that have been produced at the time, and I mentioned a few here. And really, from then on, the space for security concept has really been constantly an ever-evolving work until today. We have had even recently, I quote here, 3 interesting increments, I would say, in the building of such space and security concept in Europe. We have had the space strategy for Europe that's been published in 2016, and that's addressing also the notion of security in space and the notion of the need for making sure that the space system in Europe and belonging to the European Union can be used in a safe and secure way. And there's also, for example, in this particular document, an insistence of the need to develop capabilities for monitoring space, for space and tracking, and space surveillance and tracking. And that's an interesting also recall that's been made in this document. We had also, of course, and you all know that, what's called the Permanent Structured Cooperation that's been started in December 2017, and there are in this, these are gathering of member states willing to develop in common defense-oriented programs. And in this particular activity, we can, for example, identify 4 space-related projects that have been pushed and promoted. And of course, we have the well-known European Defense Funds for the period 2021-2027. With forthcoming tenders also intended to increase the capability of the EU to develop defense and security related programs and technologies. So all this is a very slow process, very progressive, which obviously must also has a strong political justification, and is rightly so requiring internal debates, internal discussions to make sure that these policy orientations are completely in line with the evolution of the environment, and in particular of the international environment, but also with the space environment itself. Okay, because and I will now focus on the latest development in the space security environment. I think we have to realize that this environment has really been the subject of very deep transformations in the last years, more than it's been exposed to in the precedent decades. The transformation has accelerated, and for, I would say, for three reasons. First, space more and more has become what's called a strategic enabler. The evolution of the use of the military uses of space, first by the superpowers I was mentioning earlier, and in particular by the United States, has been tremendous. The space applications have not only been used for monitoring, for observing enemies' capabilities, but they have been more and more used to help wage external operations, to be used on the theater of operations. So this relationship between space systems and real combat operation has been increased over the last two last decades, and now space has become part and parcel of the operational defense systems, of the operational military forces when they're sent on theaters of operations. That's very new, because that makes space an element of global security and defense system architectures and systems of systems. It's creating a holistic approach of national security, and which encompasses military security, environmental security, homeland defense, I mentioned this, and also economic and industrial security. It looks like space has been enlarged in terms of uses to different domains, and it's clear that making space, first of all, a core capability of military forces has changed the status of space systems. And at the time, space has also been seen and been perceived as a potential target or in future wars or in future conflicts. Adversaries have started to perceive space systems as potential targets, and we will see that this will have consequences on the security in space. And this is a rather new, and this is something also Europe will have to face with. As I said, the space drivers for security and defense used to be first, historically speaking, determined by what I call the strategic space. Space was born from the nuclear military revolution, and space remained confined to a small club of mainly the two superpowers, which developed their systems to really assess each other's capabilities. And then we have this new, I would say, new military uses of space that have evolved, especially after the first Gulf War. It was realized that space was also used to guide precision munitions, for example, with the PNT satellites, with the GPS satellites, but also you could use Earth observation satellites to detect mobile targets. You could use adapted early warning satellites to detect short-range ballistic missiles, stuff like that. So space was more and more entering into the tactical, operational military world. And then it would become, they would become, as I said, targets, or at least possibly perceived as targets. And then what we see today is that we go more and more, we go from the notion of space for security to the notion of security in space, because we have seen the emergence of new risks and even new threats in space against space systems that we need, that will require, in fact, to adapt systems to protect themselves, and possibly to adapt systems to monitor what's going on in space. And this is the new era, I would say, in the military use of space. I call that controlled space. And we went from strategic space to operative tactical space to today controlled space or security in space. So this is very important. Of course, this evolution has really enlarged more and more something that was started with the only military uses of space, very strictly speaking. So you had the development both in the United States and in the USSR of stricto sensu military systems, but it has evolved since, and more what you see are systems, programs that can do both fulfill military missions, but can also be used for larger security missions because the technologies are evolving, because you have more and more objects in space, you have more and more capabilities to collect a whole lot of information, different informations from the Earth, whether it's Earth observation information, data collection, whether it's electromagnetic signal interception, etc. You will have more and more systems used, whether by the military or by the governments at large, or maybe more and more used also in the commercial domain. We see that more and more emerging, creating a very large, indistinct pool of systems, pool of capabilities that several users will be able to use for their own purpose, whether they are military, whether they are security oriented, where they might be even other kind of users. So this is my second point here. I mentioned the transformation of the military uses of space. I must also mention, as another key element of this global evolution, the relationship that has become closer and closer between space technologies and information technologies. In fact, space technologies are now strongly connected to the evolution of the information domain. And space has been seen by some observers as a key contributor to the so-called information dominance in modern wars, but also more and more in modern politics, in modern, I would say, international relations, strategic relations. The information dominance has been really deemed as the key element of the relations between power relations between countries. Space has clearly become, since the 90s basically, has clearly become one of the key elements of these information dominance strategies. So this is my second point. My second point is that this information space convergence has been viewed with a lot of attention by the security and defense community. More and more, and this is new for these last years, we have seen this emerging. We see the emergence of concepts like defense and security space infrastructure commodities. The idea is that you may not develop strictly military capability. You may develop some, but you may use some others. What you will develop are more information infrastructures, whether they are military, whether they are governmental, whether they are even commercial. And as a security stakeholder or military stakeholder, you will want to use whatever is proposed to you. And this is an interesting evolution, because it has, in fact, allowed the development of projects for example, of mega constellations. With the technology now, we can envision the development of thousands of tens of thousands satellite constellations. We have the example of Starlink today, but it's only the first of its kind. And these constellations more and more are used are perceived as mere infrastructures, mere commodities that are very useful because they bring more and more resilience for defense and security users. Using such capabilities is very can be seen as is very beneficial in terms of resistance and resilience, resistance against any attack, and resilience once some capabilities have been shut down. The more you can rely on a diversified set of capabilities, the better off you are in terms of resistance and resilience. So we see more and more the space infrastructure and community as an indistinct architecture of systems, which make both nodes, whether they're space, aerial, or terrestrial, but also downstream activities. Once you have collected data, you have to process data, and you have maybe to merge data, and then you have to generate information and disseminate this information. And this makes this downstream more and more critical for success. It's interesting to see that the recently proposed constellation in Europe, by Commissioner Breton in particular, about for bringing secure connectivity, is also part of this general move. You know, we see this kind of project emerging in most of the key spacefaring countries. It's true in the United States. It's true in China. China is investing more and more in this domain and really wants to become a key player in the field of connectivity and worldwide connectivity using constellations and using information technologies. And the EU at some point is also contemplating to develop this kind of capability, which also could become a flagship program in a sense. And it's interesting to see that precisely this kind of capability is at the crossroad of different users, different types of application, and can also be used for security at large. And it can encompass a number of different applications that can be really useful for the security of the European Union. And of course, the challenge for Europe in this particular case would be to structure its downstream effort. I mean, in the industry, in the technology, information technology domain, that remains, of course, a key for ensuring the success of such programs. But it's interesting to see that the European Union is beginning to position itself to think about these issues. Okay, so this convergence between security and information has started some 30 years ago. It's as I said, it's more and more space because of the evolution of technologies is being perceived more and more as an infrastructure for the security and defense demand side. It's the interest of a distributed infrastructure is really key here, and so of course space has become perceived more and more as a key possible vulnerability, even if distributed. The idea now is that space will become an environment by itself, you know, in which you could have security issues at stake, whether it's for individual space systems, whether it's for constellations, whether it's for access to space. So the more you will depend on space, the more you will make it a key domain regarding a critical domain for you, and then it has to be immune against any risk and threat. So this is very key here. So what we see also in this, and this is my third point, what we see from the last years is that we have an increasing number of objects that will be launched in space with a diversity of actors, whether they are public, whether they are military, whether they are commercial, whether they are private. And we will have a space environment that will be deeply transformed in terms of usage, in terms of the performance of satellites. Satellites will be more and more maneuverable. They will be smaller and more smaller. They will be smarter and smarter. You will have a large increase of numbers of satellites at each orbit, usable orbit and the operational orbit, which means that the more we go into this direction, the better we must be equipped in terms of space situational awareness, capability to know about the situation of space, what's going on in space. That's going to be more and more critical. And it's going to be all the more critical that we're going to depend more and more on space, and even for our own security, and also possibly for military operations that will be conducted by this or this state in external operations. The more you're using this for your own security and defense issues, the more you're depending more and more of an environment that is more and more uncertain, more and more difficult to read. And this is going very quickly. The evolution in 5 years has been unprecedented in terms of, there has been a larger number of satellites put up in space in March of this year than in the whole 2016 year, the whole year 2016. We have had more satellites in 1 month launched into space, than in 1 year in 2016. So you see that the evolution is really getting very quickly. It's accelerating. So we have to be at the European Union level aware of this speed and of the speed of this change. Okay, so it seems like we're entering what I call the controlled space era, which is both, the idea for a number of spacefaring nations today to be able to be in space to protect their own assets and possibly to have some sort of capability to act in space for their defense. The resurgence of that has started in 2007 with the first anti-satellite test that has been carried out by China. This 2007 ASAT test really triggered a new dynamics in this field. 1 year later, a bit more than 1 year later, the United States have also shut down one of the satellites, also for safety reasons, because the satellites was deemed as dangerous, considering the chemicals they had on board, and it had to be destroyed before it entered into the atmosphere. But still, the demonstration was there. The US were capable to respond to China in terms of demonstrating their ability to shut down a satellite. And then India in March 2019 also did the same. And we had this latest ASAT anti-satellite test performed by Russia mid-November this year. We see this, increasingly becoming part of military doctrines in all these countries. And this is very important. On the diplomatic side, this change of the strategic context also has led to new legal initiatives to regulate such activities. There has been a number of diplomatic initiatives, including one undertaken by the European Union in mid-2007, which was called the International Code of Conduct Initiative. Unfortunately, this was not supported by the international community so much, but there are hopes that this kind of code of conduct, inviting countries to adopt responsible attitude, behaviors in space, will in the end prove to be an interesting tool for regulating international relations in space. There are also competing treaty projects like the Prevention of Placements of Weapons of Mass Space Treaty from China and Russia that are more legally binding, but that are not covering all the issues relating to space safety and security, and a number of other UN initiatives, including right now with new efforts by the UN to create discussion platforms, I would say, between the main spacefaring countries on space behaviors and space responsible behaviors. And we have a new open-ended working group. It's going to start its work in 2022 and will go on for 2023, trying to reconcile views here. It's very tense. It's become more and more difficult in a sense, even if there has been some progress lately in the discussion, but still it's something very difficult to manage. So we have this. And the point is really, I would say, to highlight four aims, four goals. The first one is preventing the development of space weapons. That's very important, of course. Second one is to curb the causes of satellite discretion, whether they are unintentional, like debris, and the debris issue is a very, very key issue here. Or it can be also, of course, the discouraging or even prohibiting intentional destructive activities, such as the one that's been performed recently by Russia, creating debris. And once you have created debris, the debris are up there for years and centuries and can be very, very disruptive for space activity. But it's also it has also something to do with the management of orbital positions and traffic. What it's called. There are discussions right now on the national proposals for proposing space traffic management rules to the international community, and Europe will have its work to say in this also for its own security and for its own activities. And there's also the management of the radio interferences. So. These are only domains of discussions right now. There is no organized entity to deal with this at the international level. Each major country in space will try to push, of course, its proposals and will try to advocate its own strategies, and Europe must be part of this. Europe has competencies and also interests to defend. And we'll have to be part of this. But this is really what's going on right now in the space environment and where we are. So what are the main challenges for Europe, for space security in Europe? As I said, Europe is getting more and more dependent on space for her security at a time when space has become less and less safe and secure. There's a contradictory move here, an antagonist move. You're becoming more and more dependent on something that is less and less safe and secure. So that create more tensions, that create more, that has to lead to a better organization, that has to lead to better cooperation, better transparency. And Europe certainly here has a key role to play. The convergence between information technologies and space also invites to redefining the notion of security from space, and we must, space is more and more embedded in a larger domain, which is the information domain. And when you're talking about security from space, you're talking about security of the whole system. And you're talking about, of course, security of the space systems, you're talking about the security of the ground stations, for example, you're talking about the security of your industrial base for exploiting this data, etc., etc. You have to address, for example, cyber attacks more and more, and this is part of the space security today, and this will be more and more necessary. Of course, as far as Europe is concerned, security, we can see, and we can see that very clearly, it's more and more an issue for the European Union. But of course, defense really remains in the hands of the member states themselves. So this is an issue here. We have to find the right interface between proactive security-oriented posture of the European Union and keeping able to even rely on national member states' competencies, and also and to ensure their own sovereignty in the domain, in the defense domain. So this is something that is very this is a fine tune. We have to find some fine tuning in terms of the evolution of how Europe can handle this security space issues. And by the way, protecting space assets, etc., will have to be also discussed between member states, between possibly different international entities, and of course there will be a large collection of different actors, whether they are states themselves, whether they are regional organizations, whether they are international organizations. So this is also something Europe has to clearly watch in terms of evolution. But Europe, the European Union, really has to think about these things, because there will be more and more traffic with new orbital management technique. I told you about constellations, you know. For Starlink, we're talking about 12,000 satellites and maybe leading to 42,000 satellites. It's been calculated that in 2030, there might be, if all the projects are developing as forecasted, there might be 100,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. It's something that we've never experienced before. So we have to be very creative and very proactive in conceiving new rules, new regulations for allowing this kind of activity to coexist without creating accidents or risk, and without giving the possibility to, I would say, hostile countries to develop some hidden capabilities, etc. So this has to be dealt with on a collective basis, and the European Union has its role to play here again. And we will have more and more diverse players and stakeholders with possible impact on general security. And it's really a point that I want to stress here. So what could be from there, what could be, and that will be one of my last slides, what could be a possible space security roadmap in Europe? As I mentioned several times already, space surveillance capabilities clearly have become a logical prerequisite for future sustained investments in space. Clearly in the European Union, which already supports a European Union program for space surveillance and tracking, has to step up its effort in this domain. Satellites are becoming smaller and smaller. We have to be able to detect these satellites, to see them. We have to be able to catalog these satellites, to understand how they move, etc. All this is technically very challenging, and Europe has all the resources, industrial, technical, scientific, to develop specific competence in this domain. Of course, given the growing number of objects and associated risks and threats in space, the EU must also position itself to play a critical role in setting the norm for future international space traffic management rules and concepts. That's very important. It's not enough to have the technical capabilities and capacities to address these issues. It is also very important for the political positioning of Europe, for the competitiveness of its industry, for the whole role it can have in developing these collective systems of rule. It's very important that the EU invest in these discussions based on its own technical capabilities, by the way, and on the fact that it can rely on its own very first rank industry, I would say, in the world to maybe propose some technical and legal possibilities and orientation. So that's very important also. And also we have to take into account, as I said previously, the rapid evolution of the dual use technologies. And again, here, the EU must also prepare for preparing itself. I mean, the EU must prepare itself for collective decision about the possibility of unexpected security event in space. And it must certainly reinforce its governance procedures regarding security-related measures. Today, it would be very difficult for Europe to really respond to any event that could happen to one of its systems or satellites. It's already technically very difficult to understand what's happening as soon as you have a satellite that stops functioning. It would be also very well advised for Europe to be maybe to develop its ability to attribute, to say for sure that where the problem comes from, and possibly attribute the origin of the problem. It's important from a technical perspective. It's also important from a political perspective and a security perspective. And this is certainly a domain in which Europe can really make the difference. Europe is really at the highest level of technology evolution, of space technology development. And it must it must develop its capability to make this a politically actionable quality performance. So clearly, and I would like to stop to end my presentation on this. If I had to summarize this and summarize the relationship between security and space in Europe, I think for Europe it's clear that these four items here are key for thinking its own relationship with space. First of all, space applications are more and more devoting to security issues at large, societal security issues. It's not strictly military oriented per se. It doesn't exist anymore so much, except for very small identified core programs, but more and more high performance satellites can be used in many different domains and will be more and more used in the security domain, that's for sure, and Europe must understand that. The space landscape will be deeply transformed. It's not at all the landscape we used to know when it was started, between the US and the USSR, and the US and the USSR. It has become much more diverse. More than 80 countries own at least one satellite in orbit nowadays. And when you see the number of the exploding number of satellites in space, they mainly come from private actors. So this is also changing the whole domain. We have more, as I said, more and more diverse players and stakeholders. And we have this new policy technology connection that has been created between space and information technologies. The role of the cloud, for example, for institutional use, for governmental use, will be very key in the development of space constellations. So all these are key challenges for Europe. You cannot look at space only through a very narrow window. You have to look at space in a very wide manner. This is a demanding task for Europe, that's for sure. The operational context remains difficult. I mean, space is a difficult context. We have a mixing of different communities, which is not easy to handle and to organize. And also we have to get agree on a European concept of security. And that's certainly not the least of the challenges. But after all, and I want to end on these positive notes, I think Europe is used to think in terms of cooperative terms. After all, Europe is the only part of the world where you can share together this kind of thinking. It has allowed collating national competencies at the regional level via several procedures. Europe can be very creative when it comes to creating platforms and creating exchanges and ways to cooperate. And we have this multinational experience already at hand. And I think Europe can even be an example for addressing space security issues that will be a collective problem, an international problem at all levels. So Europe not only can play a role, but it can also show example of how we can make sure that collective security can be improved in the future. So I will stop there, and I thank you for your attention. I hope it has triggered questions for you, and I will be happy to answer them when you want to ask them. Thank you.
Many thanks, Xavier, for this comprehensive overview of the European space security landscape. Maybe I will pose the first question. You pointed out that the US and USSR use space programs to satisfy their, quote, Cold War era strategies, unquote, just to quote you. So they use the space, as you mentioned, to enhance their strategic warning communications and nuclear force structure, and they also conducted extensive testing, as well as limited deployment of ASAT weapons. They both decided to end their ASAT deployments, but they were not able to reach any agreement on treaty or rules of the road, or even defining what constitutes a defensive or offensive space system. In the light of the recent ASAT test by Russia, for example, which you mentioned in your presentation, how would you assess the current status of space security, and what can Europe do to reduce any potential tensions?
Yeah, I think, yes, indeed, Jana, you're right. I think, yes, for sure, anti-satellite systems and tests have not started in 2007 with the first Chinese test. And the history shows that the United States and the USSR, especially the USSR, by the way, have tested a number of ASAT systems during the 60s and the 70s and even to the early 80s. And the United States have used, especially experimented one anti-satellite missile in 1985, a bit to respond to the USSR very intense activity in this field. Still, it hasn't given birth to any arms race in space stricto sensu. Clearly, these have been experiments that took place in a very specific context when neither the United States nor the USSR had any interest in destabilizing the space environment, because it was the guarantee of maintaining the strategic relationship, the balance in the context when you have nuclear forces facing each other. And clearly, I would even say that satellites have been used as life insurance in a sense. You know, this was the so-called national technical means, you know, that were mentioned in the disarmament and limitation talks treaty. They were talking about NTMs, you know, national technical means. The point was to mention if as satellites were not recognized officially, so they were mentioning this national technical means as guaranteeing the functioning of the nuclear mutual deterrence and the verification of the treaties, etc., etc. So neither the United States nor the USSR had any benefits in destabilizing space. The new thing is that because space is more and more used in the military operations today, we have seen, and especially with the signal sent by China in 2007, you know, a resurgence of, or at least the emergence of a new interest to consider satellites as potential targets, as possible targets. And indeed, this series, okay, from 2007 to 2021, we have had 4 tests, really, with 4 distractions, I would say. Still, it's worrying because it feels like the inhibition that was existing in the 60s, 70s doesn't exist so much anymore, and you see power demonstrations through this ASAT test. So I think one good possible options for Europe and it would be to push this current idea that first of all, using kinetic intercept tests should be prohibited because of because it's creating debris and it's destabilizing the space environment. I think this is an idea that really could be pursued in terms of envisioning a ban, an international ban on this kind of test. Clearly, more than that, I think Europe today, and in a sense, France did that. You know that France has published a space defense strategy 2 years ago. And basically it says, okay, we recognize that, okay, we see the evolution, the development of space, new space program, new space military programs, space weapons program, and we understand that this evolution, and we can regret it, by the way, but we understand that this evolution is not here to stop, because countries mention the legitimate need for defending their own assets, etc., etc. So if we have to go this way, then we have to do it in a responsible manner. We have to create more transparency, and we will have to do this in an ordered manner. In a sense, you know, I think what will be required, and Europe could be at the edge of this, would be a call for much more transparency and much more in terms of what the countries are doing, in terms of declaring, notifying what they want to do, etc., etc. After all the countries are interdependent in space. And once you have a country that destroys a satellite, it will create debris that will hit each other's satellite, including its own. So I think the space environment is so much specific in terms of acts and consequences that it requires to coexist anyway. We will have to coexist. National security will be based on collective security. It will depend on collective security. And then certainly transparency could be something that Europe could pursue much more and create its own way, by the way, also to have a better understanding of this space situation today.
Thank you. One of the things that I think you very ably described is how Europe has evolved in terms of connectivity between the space domain and security. And you also mentioned that the complex web of national programs, ESA, European Space Agency programs, and the EU level programs. One of the panelists is asking, based on your extended experience, would a bottom-up project on European security connectivity, which would involve using the national assets, be easier to implement rather than the establishment of the top-down EU space and defense strategy framework that sets guidelines that address the first-time use security in space issues?
Yes, yes. This project is that's European Union connectivity, secure connectivity project. Is really, I think, should be part of an integrated approach to security, but also should be part of an integrated approach of what could be a European space program. If you look at what's happening in this domain, whether it's in the United States or in China, for example, you will realize that you have three main players here. You have a space sector, of course, able to access space in a very low-cost manner and conceive small satellites, very cheap ones, etc., that you can launch in numbers. This is one thing you can do. It can be done in the United States, can be done in China, it can be done in the European Union and by ESA and by European countries. You have another domain, which is necessary, ingredient, which is necessary. It's the added value downstream sector that exists and that will make use of these new constellations, of these new connectivity capabilities to ensure that it can connect people for its own services, and especially for the cloud services, for example. And in the United States, it's been very much well exemplified by the partnership between SpaceX, for example, and Microsoft Azure. SpaceX had the interest to connect with Microsoft Azure and its customership, and Microsoft Azure had some benefits in gaining connectivity using this kind of capability. And then the third, of course, there's a third player in this kind of industrial adventure. It's it's a powerful public sector that is ready to invest massive dollars in this particular case for triggering the pump, I would say, for starting the business model. In this particular case, DoD was ready to use this Microsoft Starlink offer to entrust them with the DoD cloud capabilities, and they were ready to pay $10 billion over 10 years for doing so. And so you have a three actors kind of relationship, that help trigger the pump and help trigger the process over 10 years, so that you have a public support first, and then once it's launched, you can create your own business stuff. If you look at China, you might have the same. Maybe it's a bit hypothetical here, but you have this kind of space sector. You have this kind of downstream, very active actors with Alibaba's, Tencent, and all these guys, and you have a very strong government, able and willing possibly to invest in this kind of things, also for answering its own needs, but also for developing new capabilities. In Europe, we have to question ourselves about this. We have this space sector. Do we have this downstream sector? We have to promote it at least. And we don't have the same major players that exist in the other two countries, but still we can have political justifications for equipping the EU with, for example, with a connected cloud, for example. And that will certainly support a number of programs that the EU wants to develop, whether they are security, even military oriented, or more largely infrastructure oriented. So we have to think about space connectivity by integrating, in his view, all these side activities and all the potential developments, economic developments that it could bring about. So I think we still need to do it. We need to make it a political, but it will come. Yes, it can come from a bottom-up approach. We need to engage all the players, all the competencies wherever they are, to make sure that it can solidify and consolidate.
Yeah, thank you, Xavier. And I'm also glad you mentioned the fact that there are these other external competitors that now Europe has to decide how to basically address. I'm noticing that it's already getting a high level attention in Europe. For example, at the ESA ministerial meeting, they agreed that one of the inspirators, as they called it, is to address competition, including from the authoritarian countries. And the recent meeting of the French President Macron with Vice President Harris also noted that the two countries have to collaborate on enabling a sustainable space economy. So this is, I think, also very important developments. In this connection, you mentioned international partners, and you mentioned countries like South Korea, India. There are others, like UAE. What role do you think they play vis-a-vis Europe's strategy to push forward some global space governance, and how do you think that Europe can be or is an attractive partner for such countries?
I think, thank you for this question, Jana, because I think it's precisely the kind of activity where Europe could really demonstrate its specific ability and capability to put in connections countries that usually are difficult to connect, I would say. And Europe, because of its history in space, and because of its long history of cooperations with a number of diversified countries, can be certainly one of the most efficient actor in devising a way to put countries around the table and make them communicate on on the necessity for the whole space community, for the whole international community to find ways for improving, enhancing collective security in space. And that's really my conviction. We know that there are today, for example, in Geneva, in the disarmament conference, very strong opposition between the United States on the one hand and China and Russia on the other hand, defending different approaches to space security, etc. Europe is somewhere in between, is in a sense closer to the United States and from the perspective proposed by China and Russia. But still, I think it's important for Europe to, maybe she's the best placed to propose again a comprehensive approach, betting on its good relationship with, yes, India, for example, will be certainly a central actor in promoting, in helping promote this at the international level and in helping gaining support, international support for this project. By the way, the International Code of Conduct I was mentioning a moment ago has been very weak in terms of seducing, in terms of convincing the international community, and especially a number of countries that didn't really understand why the European Union was creating this on its own and was proposing that as a package, I would say. Certainly, we have to do it differently. We have to do it in a more incremental way, in a more participative way, in a sense. But the European Union remains, in my view, very well placed for doing so.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I do think that Europe has a really big role to play in terms of how we project the future space governance and all the economic issues. You mentioned the downstream sector as an extremely important element of that. There is actually a question which is more legal oriented, so I will pose it, but
Okay.
I'll
see if I can
leave it
answer.
up to you. That if there is a current or future role for the International Criminal Court and or the World Court, both located in The Hague, to arbitrate, mediate, or adjudicate global space security issues. So I don't know if this is your lane.
I'm not, as you said, I'm not a lawyer, and I wouldn't really answer directly this question. What I get from this question is the larger question about, okay, what's the legal status of space in a sense, and what are the responsibilities of states in this? Well, we all know that what's been done until now, whether the latest or ASAT test, anti-satellite test, or the one before, they were legal. There are very few legal texts that regulate space activities, and one of the, and you know that very well, Jana, one of the main texts is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and basically it doesn't prohibit a lot of, it does only prohibit the deployment of weapons of mass destruction in space, and beyond that, everything's allowed. So today we are clearly in an unregulated space environment. Space is an unregulated environment, and this is something that is more and more posing more and more issues and raising more and more issues, because, as I mentioned before, we have an explosion of the number of actors and the type of actors, etc. And so you have to have national laws that will, in fact, create responsibilities for operators, etc. But in the end, states remain the legal responsible entities for any activity carried out in space. So we have to be very careful here, maybe to realize that space is mostly an unregulated activity. We will have to regulate this activity, because otherwise it won't function. It just won't be able to function, because the coexistence, because the collision avoidances procedures, the sharing of electromagnetic spectrum, of orbital slots, all this will have to be regulated. And to my knowledge today, the International Court of Justice would have hard times today, grasping, seizing the issue, but of course we have to make space an environment that is legally more responsible.
Yeah, for sure. And I see that Mr. Matyáš pointed out that the harmful interference, for example, there's the ITU radio regulation, but of course that doesn't regulate a lot of that intentional activities, which we regularly don't have time to get into as we run out of time. So I will take this opportunity to conclude this session. I'd like to thank you, Xavier, again. Thank you so much for being with us here tonight. And I wish everyone a nice remainder of the rest of their day, if it's afternoon somewhere else, and the evening to everyone in Prague. Good night, and I hope to see you soon on another occasion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.